Good afternoon. This is the second of three videos regarding the four major research perspectives, at least in psychology. And we're still talking now about perspectives that emphasize internal factors, factors that come from inside the body. Remember, in the last video, we finished talking about biological perspectives. Today, we're going to talk about, or in this video, we're going to talk about cognitive perspectives. So, the cognitive research perspective is one whose major explanatory focus is how mental processes, such as perception, memory, problem solving, and work, uh, impact behavior. Okay. It examines mental processes from the beginning, which is perception. All right. In other words, and perception, by the way, is done through your senses, all the way through higher level processes, which is problem solving and reasoning. All right. Steps that certainly take place in the brain. So perception starts with what we used to call the five major senses. Now, I do have to say that in reality, there's a lot more than five senses. I know that when you were in kindergarten, they referred to the five senses as touch, sight, smell, taste, and hearing, right? But in reality, the sense of touch consists of about 20 or 30 different things. And so you're talking here about, think about all the things you can sense with your fingers. You can put your hand on a tabletop and determine whether it's smooth or rough. You can determine whether it's sharp or dull. You can determine whether it's hot or cold. All right, and there's a whole host of other things that you can actually sense through the sense of touch. So in reality, there's a lot more than 25 senses, or five senses rather. There's more like 25, but that's a story for a different course. Now, our senses, of course, are the first step in perception. All right, this is how we take in signals from our environment and determine what's going on in the world around us. But in terms of psychology, it's the processing and the integration of the data that we collect that's far more important. All right, we need to know what to do if we touch a hot stove. All right, we need to know how to react if we hear a loud noise, or see a baseball or a rock or something flying at our heads. How do we react? What do we do? In order to figure that out, you got to process the information, and that's really that processing. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the cognitive perspective and the cognitive factors here. Now, so let's start with the senses, and then we'll make our way into the actual cognitive stuff. All right. And even though I told you a minute ago that they're really only, that there are like 25 senses or so, we're going to start with the basic understanding that there are five, and we're going to kind of lump all of the touch senses into one. Okay. The other senses, of course, are taste, which is done usually in the mouth, although in reality, you may be aware that your sense of taste is really dependent upon your sense of smell. Right? If you pinch your nose and you can't smell anything, you can't taste anything either. All right? It also makes it hard to talk. All right. So your sense of smell is actually far more important than your sense of taste. Your sense of hearing. All right. Knowing what's going on in the environment around you is dependent upon you being able to hear the noises that are being made around you. By far, probably the most important sense for most humans is the sense of sight. All right. Now, by the way, you can do without any of these senses, but you can't do without all of these senses. All right. But for humans, sight is probably the most important, at least for most folks. All right. Because we are visual organisms. We process more information with our eyeballs than we do with any of our other senses. And so the eyes, again, are definitely the most important of the five major senses. Let's talk about the sense of touch and how it actually works. Um, the sense of touch is dependent upon what we call cutaneous receptors. Now, these are receptors in the dermis, which is the under part, the living portion of the skin, that's sensitive to touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And you can see down here in this picture, you've got all sorts of things going on down in here. But but the most important aspect are the nerve endings here and here and here, and you can see quite a few others. But if you look, you can sense pain and heat and cold with free nerve endings, touch with Merkel discs and Krause end bulbs and root hair plexi, Meissner corpuscles. You can sense pressure with Pacinian corpuscles and Ruffini endings. All right, and so you can determine a lot of stuff about your environment by using your fingers and touching. Okay. By the way, you have far more nerve endings in your fingers than you do in almost any other place in your body. All right. If you want to determine how hot something is, or whether something is smooth or rough, you use your fingers to touch it. Right. You don't use the back of your elbow or the top of your head or that sort of thing. Right. And the reason you do that is because most of the nerve endings in your body are found, or the highest concentration of nerve endings in your body is found at the tips of your fingers. Okay. Now, I do want to point out that the cutaneous receptors and these kinds of nerve endings are not only found in your skin. You have them all over your body. And it's these kinds of receptors that also tell you, for example, when you're hungry or thirsty, or whether your blood pressure is high, or that sort of thing. So you've got these receptors all over. All right. But in terms of interpreting information from outside your body, these cutaneous receptors, the ones in the skin, are obviously the most important. Another example of a set of sensory receptors are the taste receptors. And you, as a human, are sensitive to four tastes: sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Okay. And generally speaking, when you're talking about taste, you're talking about tasting your food. All right. Now you have 3,000 taste buds, most of them found on your tongue. All right. You do have a few embedded in your cheek cells as well. Especially the ones for sour. All right. If you've ever eaten a lemon drop or something along those lines, you get that tingly feeling in your cheeks. That's because there's some sour taste receptors there. Now, as I pointed out in the previous one of the previous slides, 80 to 90% of what we perceive as taste is actually due to your sense of smell. All right. Without your nose, you wouldn't be able to taste anything. That's why when you have a cold and your nose is all stuffy, you can't actually taste your food. That's why, again, chicken noodle soup is a comfort food when you're sick, not because it tastes any different, or that you can taste it at all, but because your salty taste buds are very sensitive. And what do you find in chicken noodle soup but salt? All right, and that's why you have, or your people have, chicken noodle soup when they're sick with a head cold. Okay. Now the receptors here are found mostly on your tongue, and if you follow the path of the arrows here, we get smaller and smaller and smaller portions, right down to the cellular level. And you've got a taste pore, and so chemicals go into this pore, are received by the taste cells, and then they stimulate. They stimulate the nerve endings, which then send signals off to your brain. Okay. Now, your smell receptors. All right, and before we even talk about that, I want you to look at this number: 10 to 20 million olfactory cells. And these are, again, modified neurons that are found in the roof of your nose. Now, let me go back one slide. 3,000, 10 to 20 million, okay? Which of these two senses is more important? All right, well, obviously it's the sense of smell, 10 to 20 million olfactory cells. Think about all of the different kinds of smells that you can identify. You can identify the smell of your grandma's beef stew or lasagna or whatever it is, whatever your favorite meal happens to be. You can distinguish the smell of wet dog, the difference between a tulip and a rose in terms of their smell, a baby's dirty diaper, an idling diesel bus, and I mean, that's five, right, in 5 seconds. You can name probably 1,000 smells easy right off the top of your head. In addition, your house smells different than your friend's house. All right, they have a smelly house. You have your own normal smelly house, right? But if you go into anybody else's house, it smells different than yours. All right, for good reason. All right, different chemicals and everything else. Now, the sense of smell is based on chemicals in the air. We refer to them here as odor molecules, and you inhale these odor molecules, and they stimulate the dendrites here in the roof of the nasal cavity, all right, inside your nose. And by the way, look how big that nasal cavity is. Very few people understand just how hollow the inside just behind your nose is. In any event, those each of these odors will stimulate a different nerve ending, and that will send a signal up into the olfactory bulb, which is just inside the skull, which then sends a signal off to the brain. All right, here's a magnified cartoon picture of this. The odor molecules stimulate the appropriate nerve ending. All right, let's say the green one is the smell of wet dog. All right, well, that odor molecule will stimulate the wet dog nerve, and that will send a signal up and to the olfactory bulb and eventually off to the brain, okay? And let's say this one represents the rose that you see over here. All right, that one stimulates this nerve ending, which sends a signal up here and again off to the brain. All right, and different combinations of odor molecules will stimulate different combinations of nerves, and that's how you distinguish the different smells that you can distinguish. Okay. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, the eyeball and sight is probably the most important sense, the one that we use the most for human beings, generally speaking. Now, the eye is composed of 3 different layers. You have for the love of God, the outer layer is called the sclera, and it's the white of your eye. And it's white all around except in the very front where you have the lens. All right, the lens is part of the sclera, but obviously it's transparent and not white. Okay. So the light goes through the sclera, and then it passes through a hole in the second layer. The second layer is called the choroid, and that's the pink and the pink layer with the red and blue dots. Those red and blue dots, by the way, represent arteries and veins or capillaries. In any event, the choroid has a hole in the front called the pupil. All right, and so that light can pass through the lens and the cornea and through the pupil and eventually reach the lens, which is this structure right here. It also has thin suspensory ligaments which stretch the eyeball, the lens of the eye, or relax it in order to help you to focus on objects that are far away or close together. If you're looking at something that's far away, you want to stretch the lens out, and if you're looking at something close up, you kind of relax those ligaments. Now, the light that comes in is refracted to the inner layer, which is the retina. All right, this layer here. And the retina is where you find the nerve endings. All right, most of those nerve endings are concentrated along the back. Okay, um, and so if you have an object or you're looking at a person out here, the light rays come in and they're refracted through the lens and they go, and eventually you end up with uh, an image of the person. And the image, by the way, hits your retina upside down. It's an inverted image. Your brain then turns it right back side up. And the signals that hit the retina are sent through this large optic nerve to the back of your head. The back of your brain is where the images from your eye are actually processed. Okay. The ear is also a fairly complex organ, and it's composed of three parts. All right, you've got the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Now, the outer ear is starts with the pinna, this floppy thing on the outside of your skull, and the sound then is carried down this long tube through the bone. All right, this stuff right here represents the bone of your skull, and so the sound eventually causes the eardrum, or what's called the tympanic membrane, to vibrate at a certain frequency. Now, the frequency of the sound that you hear is dependent upon how it's produced, and you can hear very high frequency sounds and low frequency sounds, and that's just the pitch of the sound. So if Elmo is talking to you and he says, "I really like studying the ear," then that's a relatively high pitched sound. On the other hand, if you have nightmares about Darth Vader, Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. All right, that is a lower pitched sound. All right, James Earl Jones's voice is very deep pitch. Anyway, what that does is it causes the tympanic membrane to vibrate with a certain frequency, which then causes a series of small bones inside the middle ear to vibrate with the same frequency, and that stimulates an organ called the cochlea, which is this swirly thing right here. And the sound goes down, and the deeper the pitch, the less it travels. The higher the pitch, the further into it travels. This is connected to the cochlear nerve, which then again leads off into the brain. One other thing, this tube leads from the middle ear down into your throat. It's sometimes called the eustachian tubes. And this is what equalizes the pressure on either side of your ear. When you swallow, you can feel your ears pop, quote unquote. That's just equalizing the pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane using the eustachian tubes. Okay. Now, there are a couple of other parts of the ear. The semicircular canals up here are for balance, as well as the vestibule in this area, which is for determining gravity. All right, which way is up and which way is down. Okay. All right. So those are the major portions of the five senses. So all of this information is gathered and then sent to the brain. And what do we do with it when it gets there? Well, this is the perception aspect. All right, you don't really perceive something until you think about it. All right, and you process it. Okay, and that processing is what allows you to then react to a certain signal. All right. Now, most students, well, when you're talking about the cognitive research perspective, you really have to think about the internal workings of your head. All right. So, for example, if you see a certain word you generally associate something with that word. Now, if you see the word pet, for example, all right, most of us will probably think of a dog or a cat. Where'd my dog go? I don't know where my dog is. Um, but when I say the word pet or see the word pet, I think of my dog or my son's turtle or my other son's lizard or my daughter's hamster. All right, those are all pets. Um, the this is my association. Now you may think of something else. You may have a cat, or a parakeet, or that sort of thing. Come here, say hi. Can you say hi? Look, look, say hi. You don't want to look? Okay. Well, anyway, this is Gabby. She's my dog, and I love her to pieces. She's my best buddy, right? Yeah. All right. Okay. Now, um, what do you think of when you see the word pet? Okay, probably something along those lines. Now, what if you saw a different word like this one, president? All right, well, you might immediately think of President Trump. All right, or if you don't like President Trump, you may think of President Obama, or who was before Obama, Bush, or Clinton, or the other Bush, or I'm missing somebody in there, right? No, maybe not. Anyway, but whatever. You may think of the president of Siena College, all right, Dr. Gibson, who is the brand new president of Siena College. All right, you may think of the president of the company that you work for, or something along those lines. All right, but most of us have a fairly quick response. When we see the word, we associate it with something else. Maybe you think of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, all right, and not one of the more recent presidents, all right. But that word has a meaning to you, and you use that meaning to process and interpret words that you see or things that you hear. Now, there are other things that go on with your internal factors. All right, why can't you recall facts that you know you know? All right, like when you're taking a test, you read that in your notebook. You've seen it in your textbook. How do you know, or why can't you recall that fact that you really know that you know? All right, that's kind of a mystery. Why is it also that sometimes images or sounds or something reminds you of something? All of a sudden, you're just sitting there, and all of a sudden, for no reason, you think of an old friend, or your pet hamster that died when you were, 9. Sometimes those things just pop into your head for no apparent reason. All right, so why do you recall things like that when they come up? And why can't you recall other things that you know that you know? All right. So anyway, those are all questions that cognitive psychologists deal with and look at and think about in terms of their perspective on psychological research. Okay. So that, my friends, is the end of the second of 3 videos on the 4 major research perspectives. And I hope you learned something.